Yo, what's up guys? Althea, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for March of the Machine for Historic and Explorer. So March of the Machine is going to be the next set that comes out on Arena. I don't think it's coming out until the 18th, but the full set is available now, so you can go check out the full spoiler if you want to. For this video, what I've basically done is I've gone through the entire set. I just picked out any card that I think is likely to see play either in Historic or Explorer. I'm going to start off with cards that I think are more likely to have an immediate impact on the format, and then we'll move on to more fringe playable or sideboard cards as we go along. So let's just get straight into it, starting off with a pretty contentious card here. So Ragavan, Nimble, Pilferer isn't going to be in the main set, but it is going to be in a subset called Multiverse Legends that is going to be legal in Historic. Now I think myself and most of the people assumed that they would be pre-banning this card like they did with Mishra's Bauble. So when Brothers War came out with the retro artifacts that was legal in Historic, they pre-banned Mishra's Bauble, so it was never legal in the format. And I think most people assumed that they would do the same thing here, but I've heard rumours circulating recently that they might actually allow this to be legal, which is pretty crazy. Now, not 100% sure either way. They haven't had an official announcement on it yet, so there's still a good chance that they might pre-ban it, but if they allow it to be legal, this is going to have such a big impact on the format. This is going to be a very format warping card. Now, in theory, I don't mind the effect that Ragavan is likely to have on the format because it kind of incentivizes you to be playing either early interaction or early creatures to either kill it or block it so it can't start connecting. So it does encourage, interactive magic and kind of disincentivizes the non-interactive linear decks that aren't the most fun to play against. But my main concern with it in the context of Historic is that Rakdos midrange is already one of the most powerful and popular decks in the format right now, and not only is Ragavan the most natural home in that deck, but it's also the deck that is probably best against Ragavan because it's already running a bunch of cheap interactions. So I'd be very interested to see the effect that Ragavan has on the format, but my main concern is that the format will just devolve into a ton of Rakdos midrange mirror matches, which isn't the most fun to play, I don't think. Rakdos midrange, if both players are playing well, often comes down to who draws better, so I'd be interested to see the effect that it has on the format. If they do pre-ban it, I don't blame them. If they do, as long as Rakdos midrange doesn't completely take over, I think this could potentially be a really fun card to play with, but we'll have to see how it pans out. And next up, we've got Surge of Salvation. So this is definitely a sideboard card, and this, speaking of Rakdos midrange, is very good against that deck. So, there's a ton of decks that want to have protection against cards like Fatal Push, Molten Impact, Red, a lot of decks are reliant on red damage-based removal, so this provides, protection for your whole board against that, and it's also very good against discard spells as well. Since Veil of Summer got banned, we haven't really had a card that's good against discard spells. Now, obviously this isn't as good as Veil because you don't get to draw a card, but there are a number of decks that really want protection against discard spells, and so I expect this to see play in a lot of sideboards in white decks going forwards, especially if Ragavan is legal and Rakdos midrange is super popular. This is definitely going to be a great sideboard card against Rakdos, or just black and red removal in general. And next up, we've got another color hoser, so this has changed the equation. 2-mana counterspell, which is huge because I think one of the main reasons why Control hasn't really been big in Historic or Explorer recently, well, I guess, more so in Historic where Rakdos midrange is super popular, but in both formats, you're really lacking good 2-mana counter spells, and I don't think this is a main deck card. It could potentially see play in main decks in certain meta games, but this is going to be a really, really nice sideboard card in counterspell decks against red and green decks. So, the ability to counter spells with mana value 2 or less could mean that you could potentially run this in main decks if the format is very, full of cheap decks. If, in Historic, if Lurrus decks are everywhere, you could potentially make an argument for main decking this, but in the sideboard against red or green decks, this is just 2-mana hard counter spell, which is going to be really sick. So, again, I expect this to definitely see play in sideboards of counter spell decks as well. Next up, we've got Dusk, Legion, Duelist. So, this is an interesting card that, this is definitely more fringe than the other three that we've seen so far, but I could potentially see this thing play in 2 homes. First of all, is Hardened Scales. We're getting an extra Hardened Scales style effect that I'll get to a little bit later, but if you can consistently put counters on stuff like Luminarch Aspirant, for example, this seems like a really nice card advantage engine for the Hardened Scales deck. Now, again, you do need to have a lot of cards that can consistently put counters on other creatures. So like I said, Luminarch Aspirant is the one that springs to mind immediately. There aren't that many others that do it every single turn. So maybe this doesn't see the card, maybe just because we don't have that many high density cards that can put counters on other creatures. But, if we do get to a point where we have a high density of that sort of effect, this seems like a really great way to just pull ahead on in terms of card advantage, because Hardened Scales as an archetype doesn't really have great options for card advantage, and this does provide them with one. The other place that this could see play is Vampires, which hasn't really been a deck in either format, but it does pair very nicely with Saurian Imperious Bloodlord, which is probably the biggest reason to be running a Vampire deck, right? The +1 allowing you to put a +1/+1 counter on it will just draw you a card every single turn. And again, Vampires isn't a deck that's really had great access to card advantage outside of Champion of Dusk, so this is a very interesting card for two fringe archetypes. And, you know, again, if Hardened Scales can get enough effects that can put counters on other creatures, this seems like a really great addition there. And next up, we've got Elspeth Smite. So this is a really cheap interactive piece that, you know, 1 mana white interaction at instant speed hasn't really been that great in either format, right? In Historic, maybe slightly more because we have Fragment Reality, but that has a lot of weaknesses against decks that actually have a decent curve. Elspeth Smite as a 1 mana white piece of interaction is definitely better than most other options we have available to us. In Historic, especially if Ragavan is legal, this seems like it's going to be a really important card in those sorts of decks. So I could definitely see this seeing play in, you know, not only control decks, but just any deck with white that wants early cheap interaction. Like I said, in Historic, you do have Fragment Reality, but that is definitely weak against decks that have a split curve. You know, even against the low curve decks like Wizards, using Fragment Reality to kill a 2-drop is really not that great. Now, the weakness of this card is that, you know, it only deals 3 damage, so if you are against a deck like Auras, for example, or just any aggro deck that has bigger creatures, this isn't going to be as good as a lot of the other white interaction like March of Otherworldly Light or Fateful Absence, but this is a really nice addition to white decks to have in their arsenal. And I think, you know, particularly if Ragavan becomes legal, this card might be really impactful in Historic for the white interactive decks for sure. And next up, we've got Knight-Errant of Eos. So Convoke is back in this set, and this is a really interesting Convoke effect. So Convoke hasn't really been played in either format, right? Venerated Loxodon is the best of that sort of effect, and we haven't really seen it see play anywhere there. But this is, you know, the main reason why I'm, well, not optimistic, but more hopeful that this might see play over Venerated Loxodon is because it's a human. So if you're running a very low to the curve humans deck, you know, with tons of 1-drops, you know, slightly easier in Historic because you have Esper Sentinel, which is one of the best 1-drops in the whole format and in the human tribe in general. If you can run a very low to the curve humans deck, which I think is something that humans has always lacked from playing it, right? I think this card incentivizes you to play more 1-drops, which is actually probably beneficial for the deck. But if you can go, you know, 1-drop into 2 1-drops, then you can Convoke this out on turn 3 and start getting card advantage, which is pretty huge. Obviously, the 4/4 body is great as well. But the card advantage you can get off this is pretty sick. You know, I think humans as an archetype does struggle with card advantage. I mean, you have got Collected Company and Inquisitor Captain in Historic, but if you just wanted to stick to mono white, I could potentially see an argument to running this in addition to Inquisitor Captain in Historic, or just as like a top-end card in the Explorer mono white humans decks as well. So again, not 100% sure because humans does have so many options, but if you wanted to go super low to the ground in humans, which I think is a pretty good way to build it, then this seems like a pretty nice payoff for doing so. Now again, I don't think you'd be wanting to run it if you're running Selesnya, because I think Collected Company is generally better, and it's a 5-drop, so it kind of it doesn't work very well with alongside Collector's Company, but it's definitely an interesting option. Now again, I don't think you really want to be running it outside of humans, but it's definitely worth trying in the humans deck, I think. We'll have to see how it plays out. And next up, we've got Monastery Mentor. So this is another token generator, but the fact that you generate tokens with prowess makes it a lot, you know, the ceiling on this card is a lot higher than a card like Young Pyromancer, for example. Now, the big weakness of this card is obviously that it's 2/2. You know, the 2 toughness does mean that it dies to a ton of interaction, you know, particularly against red interaction. This is pretty weak the turn it comes down, but this is such a powerful card. You know, it's restricted in Vintage, although, you know, the reason it's restricted there is because you have so many 0-mana artifacts, whereas we don't really have access to that sort of stuff in either Explorer or Historic. But I wouldn't write this card off. I don't think it has a natural home right now, but it is powerful enough that I could definitely see it seeing play in some Spellslinger decks. You know, there's been some Izzet decks in Pioneer and Explorer where you run Young Pyromancer and Third Path Iconoclast, and I could potentially see, going Jeskai maybe and having Monastery Mentor as another payoff for that sort of effect. So be interesting to see if this does find a home. The power level is definitely there. I'm just not sure it has a great home right now is the main issue with this card. So next up we've got Pylon, and I think this is another card where the power level of this card is there for sure, but it doesn't have a great home in either format right now that I can think of. But if you're running a black deck with early creatures, this seems like an auto include as a removal spell, right? If you can consistently convoke this out for 0, 1 or 2 mana, it's way above curve. Even 3 mana isn't the worst. The fact that you get the Surveil 2 in addition to destroying any creature or planeswalker is really sick. So, the Surveil 2 could be nice with extra graveyard synergies as well, but you don't need the graveyard synergies for this card to be good. As long as you're running cheap creatures to be able to convoke this out, this is really huge. So if there's ever a black deck with early creatures, this is going to be a slam dunk in either format for sure. Next up, we've got Bloodfeather Phoenix. So this is another card that I think is potentially very powerful, but again, it doesn't really have a great home right now. So the fact that you can loop this from the graveyard seems pretty nice. Obviously, it seems to slot best into a burn shell because of the requirements to get it back from the graveyard. So I could see this seeing play in burn potentially, because that is a deck where your creatures are going to be dying quite often. Especially if the opponent doesn't have any blockers for flying creatures, they might have to kill this, and then you can just keep looping it over and over again. In Historic, we obviously have Faithless looting as well, so you don't even need to rely on it being killed by an opposing creature. You could just loot it into the graveyard and then get it back again later. There isn't a direct home for this right now, but Madness decks, Mono Red Madness or even Rakdos Madness decks, definitely have power level there already. And all you need to do to enable this is just increase the amount of burn spells in your deck, which isn't that hard to do, and also seems like a fine direction for Madness decks to take in general. I'm not sure this is going to be good enough to see play in a deck like Izzet Phoenix, because there's a lot of demand. There's so many options for creatures in that deck, and I don't think this is quite powerful enough there. Plus, you're not running any enough direct burn spells for that. But in a Madness shell, in a burn shell, I could potentially see this seeing play there potentially, but we'll have to see. Next up, we've got Ozolith the Shattered Spire. So this is the other Hardened Scales effect that I was talking about. So this is essentially 2 mana Hardened Scales. So obviously not as good as the original, but it also has cycling, so if you draw it in multiples, you can just cycle it away. And it also has a way for you to put counters on your creatures as well. So this is a card that will pair very nicely with the Dusk Legion Duelist, because, like I said, one of the main issues with the Dusk Legion Duelist is we don't currently have that many ways to put counters on other creatures, and Ozolith is a way for us to do that. So, but either way, I think the biggest thing with this card is that Hardened Scales is a deck that absolutely pops off if you have the Hardened Scales, and feels a lot less powerful when you don't. So being able to potentially run 8 copies of Hardened Scales, even though this is legendary, you can cycle it away, which is nice upside. But I'm very interested to return to Hardened Scales. It's always felt like an archetype to me that was, really powerful generically, but always fell a little bit short in testing. And a big reason for that was just that the games where you had scales was so much better than ones where you don't. So being able to run 8 copies of it seems like a really big upgrade for that deck, and it's definitely near the top of my list for decks to try when the set comes out. Next up, we've got Errant and Giada. So this is a really interesting card that essentially allows you to play off the top of your library if your deck is full of creatures with either flying or flash. So the first home that came to mind for me was Angels. I've been playing a lot of Angels in both Explorer and Historic recently. It feels like an archetype that has kind of got quite stale. People are just sticking to the same core, and this seems like a card that could potentially shake up how that deck is built. Now, it's very interesting to see how you would build an Angels deck with this. I think you would probably want green for Collected Company to be able to consistently get this into play. Company is already great in the Angels shell anyway. But you would obviously have to try and fill your decks with as many flying creatures as possible, which would probably mean running stuff like Gilded Goose over Avacyn's Pilgrim or Llanowar Elves, which isn't really that much of a consideration. My main thought of this, though, is whether you still play Bishop of Wings in the deck, because, you really want to be able to consistently play off the top with this. And I think it's slightly easier to do in Historic, where you have stuff like I can't remember the name. I think it's Segovian Angel or something. There's a 1-mana Angel with Flying and Vigilance in Historic. So you could run that and Gilded Goose at the 1-drop slot, then Giada, and then Righteous Valkyrie and stuff like that. So, and the biggest problem with Angels is that you didn't really have good ways to grind into long games, and you really got blown out by sweepers. And so being able to play off the top of your deck gives Angels card advantage, which makes the deck pretty scary. So I do think you'd have to build around it to make an Angels deck work with this. But if you could figure out a way to do that, it's a very, it makes the archetype from a deck that just commits to the battlefield quickly and is very good against creature decks into a deck that can actually grind into a longer game as well. Outside of that, you could also make a flash deck with this potentially. Now, flash decks hasn't really been that popular. I guess one of the other archetypes that this does potentially work quite well with is spirits as well, because a lot of spirits either have flash or flying or both. Now, the fact that this isn't a spirit itself is a little bit of an issue, and I think spirits, with the release of Shadows over Innistrad Remastered, already has more than enough options. You're already pushed for space in that deck, so not 100% sure it's going to see play there, but either way, this is definitely one to keep an eye on. I think Angels is probably the archetype that I'm most excited for, but there's definitely potential for this card to fit in a few different shells for sure. Okay, so next up we've got Kroxa and Kunoros. So this is a really interesting card because it's a reanimation effect on a really big body, which is something that we've not really seen before. Now, it is 6 mana for reanimation, which is obviously more than you would normally pay, especially in Historic where you have Priest of Fell Rites at 2 mana, Assemble from Parts, which is, 4 mana, you got Unburial Rites as well. But the main reason I bring this up is because in Historic, you can mill your whole deck and reanimate something in combination with Altar of Dementia. So the way this combo works is you either cast or reanimate the Kroxa, and then with the trigger on the stack, you sacrifice it to the Altar of Dementia, which mills you for 6 cards because it's a 6/6. Then with the ability that you had on the stack, you exile 5 of those cards that you just milled, and then you can reanimate Kroxa with its own ability, and then you can, again, with the trigger on the stack, you sacrifice it to the Altar of Dementia, mill 6, exile 5 of those, bring it back. So essentially what you do here is you get to mill your whole library, and you get to curate your graveyard because you get to pick which card to leave every loop you do. And then with the final reanimation spell, you can just get something back which wins you the game. Now, the most obvious way to do this would be with Thassa's Oracle, right? You mill your whole library, reanimate the Thassa's Oracle and win. In Historic, where this combo is legal, Altar of Dementia isn't legal in Explorer, so you can't run it there. But in Historic, Thassa's Oracle is banned because it was too powerful with Tainted Pack, so you have to figure out another way to win with that last reanimation. Now, there's a number of ways that you can do it, so figuring out the best way is going to be a little bit tricky, but I'm definitely excited to try this out. Even outside of the combo, this is an interesting card because, as at worst, you get this 6/6 body, so even if the opponent does have Graveyard Hate, you get a big threat out of it. So I'm definitely excited to try this out, and I'm definitely going to be trying to figure out the best way to build this combo as well. And next up, we've got Polukranos. I always struggle to say that, but Polukranos Reborn, and I think the only home I'm really excited for this to try at least is in Mono Green Devotion, mainly in Historic, because I feel like one of the biggest weaknesses of the Historic version of Devotion is that it has a pretty bad matchup against a deck like Is It Wizards and Is It Phoenix as well, because you don't really have good early interaction and you don't really have good blockers against that deck outside of Cavalier of Thorns, which is oftentimes going to be too slow. So the fact that you could run a 4/5 reach in that matchup seems pretty sick at just stonewalling the opponent's attacks. Now, there are other really good options at the 3 mana slot that you would have to run this over. You've got obviously stuff like Old Growth Troll in both formats, and then in Historic you also have Grizzled Huntmaster, which is a really nice card, gives you additional access to your sideboard. So I think it is going to be tough to find room for this, but especially if you just wanted to improve that matchup against Wizards, which, having played the Historic Devotion deck for quite a bit, I do feel like Wizards felt like kind of an unwinnable matchup unless you happen to get a quick Cavalier of Thorns down. So this does seem like a really nice potential option there, just at hedging that matchup. In Explorer, I don't really think there are enough flyers that make this worth running over something like Old Growth Troll, because the big advantage of Old Growth Troll is that if it does get killed, you still get to keep the devotion and you get to ramp off it. So it's really nice with stuff like Cura, for example. But I mean, that deck, you definitely do have flex slots in the Explorer version, right? I've seen some builds running Lovestruck Beast, and I could potentially see this being better there. The other nice thing about this card is that it's also a mana sink in and of itself. Now, going for the transform is risky because if the opponent can kill it in response, you do kind of get blown out, but there have been spots playing Devotion where I haven't access to a ton of mana and I just don't have a payoff, particularly against Thoughtseize decks. So the fact that this also acts as a mana sink as well as a Devotion enabler seems pretty interesting, so I'm definitely going to be testing this out in both formats. And next up we've got Wrenn and Realmbreaker. So this is a really interesting Planeswalker. So it's 3 mana, which 3 mana Planeswalkers are always worth checking out, and it gives you kind of like a Chromatic Lantern effect on the static, and then the ability to animate a land seems really nice, not only to defend itself, but makes it seem like it could be a good card in Transmogrify or Creativity decks potentially, because the land that you animate has hexproof, which means the opponent is really going to struggle to kill, they're basically not going to be able to kill it in response to your Transmogrify or Creativity. So I could see this seeing play in a Transmogrify Creativity style deck. Now, if you are running Creativity, I think you would have to be Gruul, because you obviously need triple red for Creativity and double green for Wrenn and Realmbreaker, which is a little bit, going to be hard to achieve, and I'm not sure Gruul is the best colours. Now, I have run Gruul Creativity in the past, but that was more of a best of one deck where you're just trying to cheese the Transmogrify or Creativity out as fast as possible, but it's an interesting option there for sure. The -2 milling and getting back a permanent also seems like a potentially powerful effect in a number of decks, right? You could potentially run this in Mono Green Devotion, maybe. We've just had the Polukranos as another option, and I'm not sure this really makes the cut in Historic because we have so many options, but I could see this being a flex slot in Explorer, potentially. It does provide 2 pips of Green Devotion. It does, animate the land to protect it. That deck is just full of permanents that you want to get. It helps you find Nykthos, can potentially mill over Storm the Festival. So this is a card that, I saw a lot of chatter about it. I don't think it's overpowered at all, and I do think it's only really going to fit in specific decks, but it's definitely a nice option to have going forwards. And the main 2 homes I'm going to try it in is Transmogrify or Creativity, and also potentially Devotion and Explorer as well. Definitely let me know in the comments if you've got other homes you think, because this is quite a flexible Planeswalker, right? The other reason I'm quite excited for this in a Transmogrify Creativity deck is because the passive ability allows you to hardcast Attractor if the game goes long as well. So I'm definitely going to be trying it out in Gruul Creativity and see if I can kind of resurrect that archetype as well. Next up, we've got the first battle. So this is going to be a brand new card type. Really exciting that we're getting a new card type because we haven't had that in ages. And the way this essentially works, if you haven't seen it before, is you cast it and you get an effect on the front side. So in this example, when it enters the battlefield, we get a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact token with flying, and then it goes onto the opponent's side of the battlefield with 4, defense, that's the name of it. It comes down with 4 defense. The defense varies from card to card, and then essentially what happens is the opponent is defending the battle, and you can either attack it or damage it or destroy it, and if you do, then it flips into something else. So this is what it flips into. So it's really hard to evaluate these cards, obviously, because we've never played with them at all before. But this one stands out to me because it seems like it could potentially have a natural home in Historic in the Thopters decks. Now, obviously, Thopters is typically blue-white or white-red, but I have experimented with blue-red versions in the past, and this seems like a pretty nice option because, we don't really have good ways to make Thopters. My original Boros Thopters deck was having to run cards like Barbed Spike, which was definitely the worst card in the deck because you just didn't really have that many good ways to create Thopters in the early game to fuel your Retrofitter Foundry. And this seems like a really nice option because, say you go Retrofitter Foundry on a Thopter on turn 1, make a 4/4. Then on turn 2, you can play the Invasion of Kaladesh, make another Thopter to then feed the Retrofitter Foundry, and then you can immediately attack the Invasion of Kaladesh with the Thopter that you made on turn 1, and then it transforms into this vehicle here where its power is equal to the number of artifacts you control, and obviously in a Thopter heavy deck, you're going to have a ton of artifacts. It only has crew 1, so very easy to crew, and then can just start attacking for a ton of damage in the air as well. So this seems like a really interesting option for, if you wanted to run Izzet Thopters or Jeskai Thopters potentially as just another really good way to make Thopters, because that's something the decks have been missing, right? In the original Boros Thopters, like I said, I was having to run Barbed Spike, which is a card I've always been looking to cut from the deck, but you wanted that high density of Thopters to enable the Retrofitter Foundry, so you could run, 4 on a Thopter, 4 Yotia Declares War, 4 Invasion of Kaladesh if you're in blue-red. And, if the opponent doesn't have a way to defend this, you're immediately getting a huge threat off the backside. So this definitely seems like an interesting card, and I'm going to be trying it out in a Thopter's shell for sure. And next up, we've got Urabrask. So this is, one that I'm not 100% sure is going to see play because it is quite expensive, but it is a really big payoff for kind of Storm-style combo decks. So it has a similar effect to Birgi in that whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get a red mana. So it has Birgi's effect. You also deal damage as well, so it's going to be dealing in for chip damage, but the really powerful thing about it is it also acts as kind of a Storm enabler in and of itself because you can pay red and transform it if you cast 3 or more spells, and then you get this Saga here, which is incredibly powerful. So First chapter deals 3 damage to each opponent and each creature they control, so kind of like a one-sided board sweeper that also deals direct damage to the opponent. Then you get some mana, and then you basically just get to cast a ton of stuff from your graveyard, and it transforms back into the front side that turn you're going off as well. So this seems really powerful. You know, the fact that you get this backside on it means that I think it could work in like more of a fair deck as well. As long as you're running a bunch of cheap spells, you could use Urabrask to single-handedly turn a fair cheap spell deck into a combo deck because of this backside as well. Now, my main concern with it is that it is 4 mana and it doesn't do anything the turn it comes down, you know, which is an issue we've already seen with Bergie at 3 mana, right? In Underworld Breach decks, the issue with that deck is you have to play a 3 mana card that does nothing when it enters the battlefield and hope to untap with it. And so hoping to untap with a 4 mana card is a big ask, but I think the power level is here for sure. And like I said, you could just run it in less of an all-in combo deck and more of a fair deck, which means you're more likely to be able to get this survive, if that makes sense. So I'm not 100% sure this is going to see, play in a top tier deck because it's very vulnerable to interaction, but it's so powerful and could turn a fair cheap spell deck into a combo finish that I think it's definitely worth trying out for sure. And next up we've got Rona, Herald of Invasion. So this is an interesting card. I think the only place I could see it seeing play in either format off the top of my head is potentially in Kethis combo. Now again, Kethis combo is a deck that is so tight for space now. We have so many good options in that deck that I'm not 100% sure this will see play, but the looting on this helps you dig for your key combo pieces. The main interaction I'm excited for, though, is with Relic of Legends, because you can tap this for mana with Relic of Legends, and then whenever you cast a legendary spell, it untaps it. So this potentially is another way that you can just go infinite with Kethis, and having more ways to go infinite with Kethis is just great for that deck, right? You already have Emry Relic, you already have Jace and Mux Ambers and stuff, so getting another way to go infinite with Relic of Legends seems pretty nice. And it's a legend itself, it's cheap, it's got 3 toughness, means it can block, and it also loots to help you find stuff as well. And then you do have the transform ability. That's very, very rarely going to come up, but this does seem like an interesting option to try in Kethis at the very least. Next up we've got Volcanic Spite. So this is a card that I do think is going to see play for sure in creativity decks. This is basically just an upgrade of Fire Prophecy. Now, Fire Prophecy has always been a card that I feel is necessary to run in creativity decks because you need ways to put back creatures if you draw them, so that you can still combo. Specifically, if your creativity X equals 2, like with Xenagos Worldspine Worm, Locust God, Sage of the Falls, Gristlebrand, Chiesa, being able to put back your creativity targets is vital. And the big weakness of Fire Prophecy is that it's just dead in control matchups, whereas this is great because it can hit Planeswalkers and battles as well. So if you're running creativity, this is just a slam dunk replacement for Fire Prophecy, and you could even potentially think about running more than 4 of this effect, right? If 3 damage is an important point to be able to kill creatures and stuff, you could look at running, maybe 6 effects, so 4 Volcanic Spite, 2 Fire Prophecy. Now in Historic, I don't think that's as important where we have Seek New Knowledge as a way to put it back, but you could definitely consider that in Explorer versions as well. So definitely expect this one to see play, but it's kind of a boring one because it's just a slight upgrade on an already existing card. And next up we've got Boon-Bringer Valkyrie. So this is another card that is kind of an upgrade on an already existing card in Baneslayer Angel and Lyra Dawnbringer. Now those 2 cards only really see play in sideboards of control decks. And the backup on this, the upgrade of this is that at worst you can turn this into a 5/5 flying first strike lifelink, which is essentially exactly what Lyra and Baneslayer does as well. But the backup being able to provide the buff to another creature and give it the keywords the same turn it comes down means it's probably just largely a strictly better card. Now, the obvious downside is if the opponent has a way to deal 4 damage at instant speed, for example, then it opens it up slightly more. But in both formats, there's not really any cards that deal 4 damage at instant speed that this is, it would be worth running a Baneslayer instead of this. Now, like I said, I'm not sure it's that much of an upgrade because the only decks that really run those sorts of cards are control decks in the sideboard, but I could still see spots where you have some Wandering Emperor tokens or Shark Typhoon tokens lying about, and you cast this and provide the backup buff to one of those to attack in to gain some life back. So I think going forwards, if I'm running a control deck that's running Shark Typhoon or Wandering Emperor, and I want to run a Baneslayer or a Lyra in the sideboard, I would probably just run this Boon-Bringer Valkyrie instead, but like I said, it's quite a fringe upgrade, so don't think it's going to have a huge impact. Next up, we've got another battle. So this is one that I envisage seeing play in sideboards of white aggressive decks. So battles are quite hard to evaluate, but I think this is one where I think it is, very likely to be good because the Elite Spellbinder sort of effect is very good at stopping sweepers specifically, and getting it at 2 mana is really big because in both Explorer and Historic, counterspells have always been 3 mana, or hard counterspells have usually been 3 mana, and so getting your Elite Spellbinder style effect underneath a 3 mana counterspell, even if you're on the draw, seems really powerful. And the really nice thing about this is, the matchups you want it in are going to be matchups where the opponent doesn't have many blockers. You bring this in against a control deck. So I don't think it's too hard to get this down and then attack it. And the transformed side is incredibly good against control, specifically in Explorer, because not only does it give you buffs for creatures that have attacked, but you can sacrifice it at instant speed to give yourself a I can't remember the name of it now. Heroic Intervention against sweepers, which is really sick. And it also gives you creatures hexproof, so it gives protection against single target removal as well. So this is a card that, from the aggressive deck, if you can transform this, it basically just shuts off the control opponent's way of interacting with you. Now, the reason I said I'm more excited for this in Explorer than Historic is because of Divine Purge. In Explorer, where they're relying on Supreme Verdict, this is going to be really impactful. Whereas in Historic, if you get this down, exile their sweeper, and then attack it and get this, and the opponent just goes Divine Purge, and this doesn't work against Divine Purge, that's a real problem. So I don't know if it's going to be playable in Historic purely because of that. Now, additionally, I'm not even 100% sure this is going to be that great, because the main issue with this is if you play it on turn 2, you don't commit to the board, which slows down your board presence, which is definitely an issue. If you can go 1-drop into 2-drop, play this on turn 3, which is a reasonable line because then you can potentially get rid of the Supreme Verdict before they have a chance to play it, then attack it down with your creatures, then I think it's good. So the downside of this card is you do have to take a turn off committing to the battlefield in order to play it, but if getting to Elite Spellbinder something and then provides protection from a sweeper means that I think this is going to be a really good card against control in Explorer. But like I said, because of Divine Purge, I'm not sure this really cuts it in Historic, unfortunately. Next, we've got Glistening Deluge. So this is another sideboard card, specifically against green and white decks, which is, green and white is a very creature-heavy color for the most part. So having this in black sideboards against go wide, white and green decks seems great. 3 mana for -3/-3, specifically against green and white, means that you can also run this in your own creature deck. Typically if you're running a black creature deck, you can't run sweepers. So this, I guess it does also hit your creatures for -1/-1. But, as long as you're running creatures that have more than 1 toughness, this seems great. But just in general, even if you're not, even if you're running Dimir Control, this seems like a decent sideboard card against green and white creature decks. Now again, not 100% sure how relevant it will be right now, but this is a really important card to bear in mind in future while you're building your black decks, specifically if white and green aggro decks become more popular. Next up, we've got another sideboard card. So this is Lithomantic Barrage. And this seems like an interesting option. Now, we did recently get Rending Volley in both Explorer and Historic, which is a decent option, but the nice thing about this is that it can deal 5 damage as opposed to 4, which allows you to, very importantly, allows you to cleanly kill Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, even if it pluses and then untaps. The fact it can't be countered means the opponent has no way to stop it outside of something like Aether Gust, so it being sorcery speed does mean that I'm not 100% sure it will see play over Rending Volley, but if the if the opponent's running something like a Baneslayer Angel or a Lyra, or you really care about being able to kill Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, this definitely seems like an interesting choice for sure. Also, works with something like Dreadhorde Arcanist as well, so definitely one to bear in mind, specifically if you're interested in killing Angels or Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Next, we've got Nahiri's Warcrafting. So this is an interesting card. Now, 3 mana deal 5s I don't think are generally cards you're happy to be running in either format, but specifically because of Shieldred, it's something that I've had to consider in a lot of red decks. If you're running a deck that is reliant on red damage-based removal, you really need to have a way to kill Shieldred for the most part, or the game, is just going to run away with it. And typically, the best option we have in Historic is something like Bristle Blast. In Explorer, the options get even worse. So this is really nice as a sideboard option against Shieldred decks, as a way to kill Shieldred. Now, it being sorcery rather than instant is obviously a drawback for sure, but the fact that you can use this to kill smaller creatures and then get card advantage means that it's actually a 3 mana deal 5 that you're pretty happy to be running. Well, I mean, you'd rather not have to run it, but because you need to be able to kill Shieldred in these red decks, this seems like an option that is good to kill Shieldred and also good to kill smaller creatures as well. So I could definitely see this seeing play. Well, I expect it to see play in decks that rely on red damage based removal, where you need to be able to kill Shieldred going forwards. Next we've got Sunfall. So this is another sweeper, and again, this is kind of a sweeper that's kind of halfway between a Farewell and like a Supreme Verdict. Now, being 5 mana for a sweeper isn't exactly where you want to be. You'd rather it be 3 or 4 ideally, but if being able to exile creatures as opposed to destroy them is important, this seems like a really nice option. You know, the comparison to Farewell is obviously there. Now, Farewell is very good specifically against artifact decks. You know, being able to get rid of artifacts, enchantments, and graveyards is obviously very relevant, but the difference between 5 and 6 mana for a sweeper is also very relevant. So I'm not sure this is going to see play straight away, but if the metagame gets to a point where exiling creatures as opposed to destroying them is very important, then this definitely seems like it could be a good option to consider. Now, again, I think you're largely looking at Explorer rather than Historic, because in Historic we already have Divine Purge. So the only way this would really want to see play in Historic is if bigger creatures were seeing play that also needed to be exiled, which I don't think is very likely. But in Explorer, if a lot of creatures have indestructible or they have death triggers, then this definitely seems like a nice option. And you obviously get you get a threat off this as well, so it is nice upside there. But yeah, this is definitely, not card I expect to see play straight away, but definitely one that's worth bearing in mind if the metagame shifts. And then we move on to, the slightly more fringe cards. Starting off here with Ghalta and Mavren. So this is obviously just a really big creature. Not really interested in reanimating this or anything. The main reason I brought it up is because it is a vampire, so you can cheat it into play on turn 3 of Saurian Imperious Bloodlord. Now, we have had options in the past like Xander, for example, which wasn't really good enough to see play. Now, the huge drawback of running this alongside Saurian is that it's double green, double white, so it's almost impossible to hardcast if you draw it, but it's worth bringing up. It's another powerful card that you can cheat into play off the Saurian, and if the opponent doesn't have removal for it straight away, it is likely just going to win you the game. And if you ever get to cheat this into play on turn 3, like I said, if the opponent doesn't have removal, you are just likely going to win the game. But again, as we saw with Xander, having uncastable cards is definitely a big drawback. I'm still going to try it out because there could be, if you consistently have looting to discard it, then that might be fine. But it's worth bearing in mind because it's just another card that you can cheat into play off Saurian. And next up, we've got another battle. So this is Invasion of Ergamon. And the main reason I wanted to bring this up is because we've never really had a looting effect that also produces a treasure. And I'm kind of interested in that because I've been trying to brew recently Transmogrify or Creativity decks that also reanimate. And this seems like a really great enabler for that. Like I said, we've never had a looting effect that also produces a treasure. So the obvious commonality between the Transmogrify Creativity and the reanimation strats is that you want to be running a big creature to cheat into play. And obviously drawing that creature isn't great, so if you did run reanimation spells, you could run, Atraxa or Serra's Emissary or whatever the big creature is that you want to cheat out. And then the fact that this produces a treasure token is great because it works with creativity to be able to cheat it in as well. So again, it being in Jund colours is a little bit awkward because you generally want to be in red-black for, Transmogrify and reanimation. But, I could potentially see a Jund deck that is looking to pitch stuff to the graveyard to reanimate and produce treasures for creativity. So, and then it does obviously have the upside of, if you attack the battle down, you get this creature as well. Now, for the most part, I don't think that will really matter because in a creativity or reanimated deck, the only way that you're going to be attacking is with an Atraxa, for example. I mean, I guess I could see spots where attacking the opponent directly doesn't kill them, so you might want to attack the battle to get this creature. But I just thought it was worth bearing in mind because I have recently been building decks where I wanted an effect that both looted and produced a treasure, and the fact that this does it is really great there. So there's no home for it right now, but if you're building a creativity reanimated deck, this seems like the perfect card for there. And next we've got another invasion. So the only reason I'm bringing this up is because it's unconditional removal. Well, it's not unconditional because it can't deal with stuff that's exactly 2 colours, but the fact that you get exile-based removal on a colourless card is pretty interesting. So, I mean, the only colours where this would really be beneficial is green and blue, where, green, typically the only interaction they run is fight-based spells, and blue is typically bounce spells. So the fact that you get the ability to exile something on colorless is pretty, big. Now again, I'm not sure there's any tier decks that would want to run this. Typically, if you're running a green or blue deck and you need interaction, you just splash a second color. So not one that I expect to have a home immediately, but it's worth bearing in mind if you are stuck in a monocolored deck for whatever reason and you needed this sort of interaction. And next up, we've got Invasion of Kaldheim, which is another card that definitely doesn't have a home right now, but if you're running a Storm-based deck that can produce a ton of mana, this does seem like a really powerful card because it essentially just gives you a second hand, right? You can exile exile all the cards, still play them, and draw a bunch of extra cards as well. So if there is a Storm-style deck, this seems like a really good combo extender in a way. Now again, there isn't really a deck that can take advantage of this immediately, but it's definitely one worth bearing in mind if Storm decks start to become more popular for whatever reason. Next up, we've got Faerie Mastermind. So this is Yuta Takahashi's invitational card, which is really cool. And this seems like a card that, again, doesn't really have a home straight away. Obviously, you would want this against decks that are drawing multiple cards a turn. So, against Phoenix, for example, or Auras. Then this seems like it could be good. The main reason I wanted to bring it up is because it is a rogue and it has flash as well. Now, I think rogues outside of the two main creatures that they run have lacked good options. We got Mercurial Spelldancer recently, which I think is a good standalone card, but you really want all of your creatures in that deck to have flash if possible. And this does, it's a 2-mana card, it has flash, it's a rogue, so I'm definitely going to be testing this out in rogues just because I have wanted an additional good rogue that also has flash. Now, it being conditionally good against decks that draw multiple cards might mean that it's not good enough, but I'm definitely going to be trying it out for sure. And it is a notable sideboard card if decks that draw multiple cards a turn become more popular. So next up, we've got Omen Hawker, and this is another card where I think it's really powerful potentially, but it just doesn't have a good home right now. So obviously a 1-mana mana dork that can tap for 2 mana is insane. The fact that you can only use this on abilities means that it needs a very specific home. So this is definitely one that I would love to hear from you in the comments if you can think of a good combo or just a good home that this could fit into. So I definitely think this is probably one that just doesn't fit into anything right now, but is worth bearing in mind for sure if something comes out in a later set where you have an activated ability or a bunch of activated abilities that you want to be able to ramp into. Because if you can consistently use this on turn 2, it's going to be so powerful because you just get ahead on mana so quickly. And next up, we've got Saiba Cryptomancer, and this is a really interesting card because it's essentially a protection spell on a creature that also has Hexproof itself. So we've seen with the recent release of Invisible Stalker how powerful Hexproof can be, and the fact that you can flash this in, protect another creature, and then have another creature in play that has Hexproof itself means that I could see this thing play in Auras potentially. Now, the awkward thing about this in a deck like Auras is you really want your protection spells to be as cheap as possible, right? You're never really happy to be holding open more than 1 mana to protect your creatures, but that's also a deck where you want a high density of creatures so you don't get run out by discard spells and removal. So I could potentially see this scene play in Auras because it fills the dual purpose of a threat that's hard to kill and a way to protect your other creatures as well. And I could even consider playing this in something like Hammer Time as well, right? We've seen with Invisible Stalker how powerful Hexproof can be there. Now, Invisible Stalker not being able to be blocked is also a really big deal, but this is definitely a nice option to consider in a deck like that as well. Now, having said that, in that sort of deck, against the interactive heavy decks, artifact removal is one of the main concerns, so it definitely wouldn't fix all of the issues there, but this is definitely an interesting card for sure. And I think this is a card that is probably better than it looks initially. But again, the fact you have to hold open 2 mana for protection does make it a little bit awkward, but I'm definitely going to be trying it out in Auras to see how it performs. Next up, we've got Corrupted Conviction. So this isn't very exciting. We're essentially just getting an extra Village Rites. So if you're running a deck where you wanted more than 4 Village Rites, this is an interesting card there for sure. The only deck where I've ever had that is the Abiding Grace deck. That is definitely a deck where, I was running 4 Village Rites for Deadly Dispute, and Village Rites did feel better just because it's more mana efficient. So I could definitely see this thing play in a deck like Abiding Grace. We also got a second Reckless Impulse as well. Now, barely any decks in either format run Reckless Impulse, so I didn't think that was really worth mentioning, but I definitely could see some decks wanting more than 4 Village Rites, and this is worth noting there as well. And then finally here we've got Portent Tracker. So this is a 2-mana mana dork that can untap target land. So not the most exciting card in the world, but I thought it was worth bringing up because Outside of the Snow card, which can only untap Snow lands, we haven't had a 2-mana Mana Dork that can untap target land in Explorer or Historic. So obviously this is just going to be able to ramp you into 4 mana on turn 3, which is nice, but it also works very well with Lotus Field. Now, we don't have enough combo pieces for the Lotus Field combo deck to be viable because we don't have stuff like Thespian Stage or Hidden Strings, but if you're just running Lotus Field fairly, the ability to have a card like this that can just untap it does mean you can generate a lot of mana. So I don't expect to see play straight away, but if a Lotus Field deck does pop up, this does seem like a way that you could, potentially abuse it. So that's it. Those are all the cards that I thought of. I'm so excited for this set. There's not really that many staple main deck cards outside of Ragavan, if that does end up not being pre-banned, but this set really excites me because it's full of cards that make me either want to return to archetypes that I haven't touched in a while, or gets me going on trying to build completely new decks around some of these cards as well. So I'm so excited for this set. Definitely let me know in the comments if there are any cards you think I missed out, or especially if you think there is some applications of some cards that I didn't talk about, because it is quite hard to think of every interaction with these new cards without having a chance to play with them. But either way, I'm so excited to get my hands on this set. I can't wait to brew with it once it comes out, and then I should hopefully have some new decks with these cards in once it does. So anyway, like I said, let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything out, or there's some new decks that you're thinking of working on with these cards, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Big up.